to AHS 426, your favorite news channel reporting on European history from the land of Seelen. I'm your host, Steph, and here's your other host, Lauren.
For today's topic, we're going to be talking about the poor living conditions that European peasants were subjected to in the centuries before the agricultural revolution. In the 1700s, peasants were left without living conditions and were often little better than their feudal ancestors during medieval times. With more on this topic, here is our meteorologist Sunny Day about the weather during this time.
Well, it was cloudy, but not with the chance of meatballs.
No, seriously, what is wrong with the weather?
The weather conditions in most of Europe were not beneficial for farming. It was either pouring rain, which caused seeds to rot, or experienced droughts, which withered crops. Ineffective harvests, combined with the persistent bad weather, produced a devastating decline of food production and a spike in food prices.
Thank you, Sunny Day. Now on to Rachel with more details about the lives of peasants. Rachel, how were the peasants in Western Europe?
Dying.
And how were the peasants in Eastern Europe?
Dead.
All right, thank you, Rachel. That was very informative.
You know, Steph, peasants really had it tough.
I agree. Despite the countless hours of work that both men and women spent in the fields, the amount of good food, warm clothes, and decent housing were extremely low. Moreover, the terrible weather conditions described earlier by Miss Day caused poor harvests and famine about every 8 to 9 years. The unbalanced and inadequate food in famine years made many people, especially peasants, very weak and therefore susceptible to illness. Among some of these illnesses were influenza and smallpox. As a result of extreme famine and disease, as much as 1/3 of the population of a given village may perish.
Yeah, I mean, that sucks for the farmers at least. Anyway, speaking of famine, here's a quick word from one of our sponsors. Famine food. You gotta do what you gotta do to survive.
Are you starving? Is the wheat too expensive for your low peasant income? Well, look no further than your local forest. Famine Foods. They come in several yummy flavors such as chestnuts, tree bark, grass, dandelions, and cannibalism. Enjoy a cheap, easy way to evade starvation. Side effects include dysentery, intestinal ailments, influenza, smallpox, and death.
Welcome back, and first up on our segment is the evolution of farming systems. We are currently live with Rachel 2.0 with the story.
Hi, Rachel here, reporting on a community building event that took place across medieval Europe, the open field system. This system divided a village's farmland into several large fields that were each cut into long, narrow strips. This way, crops were open to all farmers to farm the field as a community, and were not closed in by fences or hedges. Let's hear an opinion from a local peasant.
Yeah, the open field system was great and all, but just look at that large piece of land that's just lying fallow. And look at that soil. Look how exhausted it looks. Doesn't that just make you sad? Yeah, it makes me sad. Planting wheat year after year depleted the soil of its nitrogen and made it unfit for further cultivation. This, along with the lack of sufficient amounts of manure, meant that a year fallow was required, which meant that there's less land to produce much needed food. But hey, us peasants are still surviving, and we still have rights, so it's all good.
Over time, 3-year crop rotations were developed by farmers, which consisted of a year where they planted wheat and rye, then a year of beans and oats, and then a year of fallow. Even though farmers created crop rotation to increase produce, the starving population was still forced to leave 1/3 of cropland empty due to nitrogen depletion. If only there was a way to replace the year of fallow with another year of cropping.
Villages maintained open meadows for hay and natural pasture known as the common lands, which the community's livestock would graze and reside. It was mainly for draft horses and oxen, but open to cows and pigs of the community as well.
Now I'll hand it over to Seth, who is on site with an Eastern and Western peasant.
Thank you, Steph. Western peasant, why don't you tell us a little bit about what's been going on?
Well, the states and the landlords continue to levy heavy taxes and high rents, stripping us peasants of much of our little money.
Now let's hear it from our Eastern peasant.
in general, it was us, the Eastern European peasants, who were worst off due to the fact that we were serfs, bound to our lords in hereditary service, and that there were barely any limitations on how much forced labor a lord could require from us with little pay. This was due to the stricter nature of Eastern European absolutism.
And in response, Western peasant?
Although we experienced better social condition in Western Europe, where we were generally free from serfdom, we were still subjected to poverty. We had to pay heavy taxes, the church tithe, and dues to the lords, as well as saving seeds for the next season. This left us with only half of our crops for our own use.
Guys, I found a crop, and I'm not going to starve today. I'm so happy.
That's
Oh
great
my
to
God.
hear, Eastern
You've
peasant.
been taxed.
Who is the Lord? Oh, man.
This just in, the agricultural revolution.
Who are we revolting against?
Actually, the agricultural revolution wasn't really the kind of revolution you're thinking of. The agricultural revolution was more of a revolution in thought. A great milestone in human development.
The agricultural revolution was a gradual progression in the advancement of agricultural methods. Throughout Europe in the mid-17th century, the elimination of fallow occurred gradually throughout this time period, which allowed for an increase in the land under cultivation. The elimination of fallow was finally made possible by increasingly sophisticated and efficient system of crop rotation, which alternated nitrogen-depleting crops with grain, restoring crops like beans, peas, potatoes, turnips, clovers, and grass. This way, the soil would be revitalized while under cultivation, and the amount of land under cultivation increased by 50%.
This produced a larger crop yield, which meant that farmers had more crops like hay, root crops, and fodder for the winter months. These crops were beneficial for animals by providing more nutrients for them and allowed farmers to build their herds of cattle and sheep. Increased amounts of livestock had multiple benefits. More meat led to an improved diet for many. The amount of manure, which fertilizes the soil, also increased, which further improved the quality of the soil and allowed for an increase in grain for food. Continual experimentation led to more scientific farming.
And that's where enclosures come in. With the open field system, experimentation was not practical because any method of farming would have been approved by everyone who farmed on that common land. An emerging group of experimental scientists, some of whom were government officials, and other large landowners advocated to enclose and consolidate their scattered holdings in compact, fenced-in fields, in an effort to create a more easily engaged in experimentation to farm more effectively. This produced the new enclosure system. As they fenced off portions of their fields, farmers would also enclose their share of the commons and the communal natural pasture.
But not everyone liked this arrangement. Some of the rural poor had inadequate and small holdings on the community land. Enclosing this land would essentially result in the loss of their land, and also for many peasants the price of enclosing was just too high. The rural poor opposed this system whenever possible. In addition, some noble landlords were deterred from the system by the large investments and risks posed by the system. These opposing landlords and peasants allied against enclosures.
Such opposition was caused for the two systems of enclosures and open fields to coexist for many years, and could even be seen in France and Germany in the late 18th century, where the opposition of peasants and landlords had been successful. Only the Low Countries in England truly recognized the benefits of the new system.
And that was the agricultural revolution in a nutshell. This brings us to our next segment, the cost of enclosures in England.
What was the cost of technical progress in England, and to what extent did it result in social justice? By around 1750, around half of European farmland was enclosed.
By 1700, a distinctive pattern of land ownership and production existed in England. At one end, where the English land-owning aristocracy supported expensive investments in new technology that would directly benefit higher crop fields that would support higher rents. This class contributed to the development of enclosures by using their political power and control of Parliament to pass many enclosure acts that authorized fencing of fields and division of common lands in proportion to one's property. However, this process was already in full swing before the bulk of these acts.
At the other end were the landless cottagers who worked for wages. By 1700 in England, the ratio of whom were 2 landless workers in England for every independent farmer. They could graze only a cow or pig on the village commons. Enclosures, being completed in 1830, did not substantially increase the proportion of landless laborers.
In between were 2 other groups, a small group of independent farmers who owned their own land, and tenant farmers who rented land from large landowners, hired wage workers, and sold their output on a cash market. The small independent farmers that had been declining in number since the early enclosures were ultimately replaced by the rising profit-minded and market-oriented tenant farmers in the 18th century.
These tenant farmers were the key to mastering new farming methods. They fenced fields, built drains, and improved soil with fertilizer. Both this and farming without fallow and farming new crops like turnips that required more manpower allowed for more employment opportunities for wage workers in some areas. Therefore, enclosures did not force people off land and into towns by eliminating jobs, as has been claimed.
However, because of this elimination of common rights and reduced access of the poor to the land in the 18th century, the enclosure movement in England completed the emergence of the previously mentioned landless rural proletariat and the rise of market-oriented estate agriculture. By 1850, a small group of wealthy English landowners held the majority of the land and pursued profit by leasing their holdings to medium-sized farmers. These medium-sized farmers relied on the landless wage workers who usually ended up working a long dawn to dusk day.
Furthermore, the landless proletariat loss of independence and common rights caused them to be completely dependent on cash wages.
Ultimately, the enclosure system in England caused a proletarianization, or a transformation of a large number of small peasant farmers into a landless rural wage laborers that went further than any other European country, and this new group felt the cost of enclosures unjust and burdensome.
As we move on to our next segment, new methods of the agricultural revolution originated in the Low Countries. Holland ranked number 1 as the most advanced country in Europe in the 17th century.
Yeah, but who cares about Holland when we can go to England?
But we care about Holland.
Nobody cares about Holland. England's way cooler.
Holland has all the cool stuff.
We sent a team out to England.
No, you sent a team out to England.
Here's a random person we found on the streets of London not moments ago. Hello, stranger. Why do you think England was prospering?
Because we copied Holland.
Oh, really? We did?
You didn't know. I thought everybody knew that.
I guess not, so let me explain. By the middle of the 17th century, intensive farming was well established in the Low Countries. Continuous crop rotations, enclosed fields, lots of manure, and a diverse range of crops. One reason for early Dutch leadership in the agricultural branch was that from early on, it was one of the most densely populated regions of Europe. To support this population, they needed to obtain maximum yields from their land. In the 17th century, large amounts of Holland had been sea and marsh. To increase the amount of arable land, Dutch experts began steadily draining marshes and swamps. This pressure from populations also resulted in growth of cities and towns. For example, because of the commerce and overseas trades, Amsterdam's population grew from 30,000 to 200,000 inhabitants from its golden age in the 17th century. Furthermore, the dense population led to growth of an urban population, which provided the markets for Dutch peasants to sell what they produced, allowing each region to specialize in what it did best. This furthered the Dutch economy from commercial success.
And how did England play on this?
Well, the English were great students, and copying isn't that the best form of flattery? Specifically, drainage and water control were subjects in which they received instruction. In the first half of the 17th century, Dutch engineers made great contributions to draining the marshes and plains of rainy Europe.
Thank you. There are many famous Dutch engineers. To learn more about some of these important figures and other important innovators that contributed to the agricultural revolution, we hand it over to Alex Trebek, who will host a wild round of Jeopardy with 3 lucky contestants.
Hello folks, and welcome to Jeopardy! I'm your host, Alex Trebek. In this high-stakes game show,
3 contestants must identify influential figures and important terms that relate to the agricultural revolution. Our 3 categories are science, innovators, and engineers. Let's begin. Isabella, what category would you like to choose?
I'll take engineers for 200.
This Dutch engineer directed the largest drainage project in Yorkshire and in Cambridgeshire, which provided 40,000 more acres of land for cultivation in England.
Who is Cornelius Bermuden?
That's correct. Okay, now moving on. Isabella, your choice again.
I'll take innovators for 300.
This innovator that lived from 1674 to 1741 was part of the early Enlightenment in that he was critical toward accepted farming ideas and improved them through research using the scientific method and advocated sowing seed with drilling equipment rather than scattering seeds by hand to distribute seeds at even lengths and ideal depths to produce maximum crop yields.
Who is Jethro Tull? Part crank, part genius.
That's correct. Okay, settle down. Now, on to the last question. This gigantic new species of ox was the result of the newly emerged technique of selective breeding of oxen from the old shorthorn breed.
What is the newest ox?
That's correct. But what is selective breeding? Well then, for an explanation of selective breeding, we have a special report coming your way.
Thanks, Alex. I'm here with Dr. BuzzFeed Unsolved, here to explain selective breeding, which was inspired by the success of English country gentlemen in breeding faster horses for races. Hello, Doctor. Would you care to enlighten us on the benefits of selective breeding?
Yes, selective breeding is great for society, and selective breeding is a method by which farmers strategically select their best livestock to breed, and therefore produces larger and stronger livestock. For example, livestock became bigger and fatter, which allowed for more meat, and thus a better diet, and more manure, which improved soil quality, and in turn allowed for the cultivation of more and better crops, and more crops mean more food, which improves health.
So basically, all of this selective breeding is just more poop equals more food.
Essentially. Speaking of more people, the 18th century experienced a significant growth in population.
Now, before we talk about the population explosion, though, we need to talk about life before this event. There's this myth that people always married young and had a heck ton of kids. If that was the case, then the population would always be growing too fast. In reality, however, the population grew quite slowly.
The 3 main causes of widespread death were famine, epidemic disease, and war. Famine followed bad harvest caused by poor farming methods and periodic crop failures. It weakened the people, and disease just finished them off. Disease could also kill independent of famine, but famine was usually accompanied by disease.
War was its own brand of terrible. This indirect effects of war were more harmful than organized killings. Soldiers spread disease, took food, and disrupted the agricultural cycle. The disruptive effects of war were most apparent in the aftermath of the 30 Years' War. In some large areas, the number of inhabitants declined by more than 2/3, and at least 1/3 of almost everywhere died.
Yikes. But the population began to grow dramatically beginning in the 18th century. So, what changed? What caused people to die less, or for more people to be born?
While in some areas, disease took food and disrupted the agricultural cycle, the disruptive effects of war were most apparent in the aftermath of the 30 Years' War. In some large areas, the number of inhabitants declined by more than 2/3, and at least 1/3 of almost everywhere died.
Yikes. But the population began to grow dramatically beginning in the 18th century. So, what changed? What caused people to die less, or for more people to be born?
While in some areas, some women did have more babies because they were marrying earlier, the main cause was a decline in mortality rates.
The bubonic plague disappeared. After a particularly nasty outbreak in 1721, the plague simply never fell on Western and Central Europe ever again. One contributor was the stricter measures of quarantine in the Mediterranean ports, but chance and good luck were really more important.
Now we understand that the black rat played a large part in the spreading of the bubonic plague. Since it carried fleas, which in turn carried the disease, the black rat would have continued roaming around Europe, spreading the plague if a new challenge hadn't appeared. The Asiatic brown rat. Yeah. This new species began to drive out and eliminate the disease-carrying black rat.
Advances in medical knowledge really didn't do much. A vaccination against smallpox was found, but really only had an impact in England, and therefore didn't contribute much to the general population of Europe. However, improvements in water supply and sewerage, frequently promoted by absolutist monarchs, bettered public health and reduced diseases like typhoid and typhus. This and the drainage of swamps also reduced the insect population, which played a role in transmitting common diseases.
Another contributor to the population explosion was the building of canals and roads, which lessened the impact of local crop failure and famine. In other words, localized starvation became less frequent. Wars also became more gentlemanly and less destructive, and spread of fewer epidemics. New foods were introduced from the New World. These changes limited the impact of the three scourges: disease, famine, and war.
The growth of population also meant that there were more rural workers with little or no land, and which in turn caused industry to develop in rural areas. A new system grew because of the increased need for employment on behalf of the poor in the countryside, and capitalists from the city were more than willing to employ the rural poor, often at lower wages than the typical urban worker.
This new system was called the cottage or domestic industry. One of its most significant effects was the mechanized factories grew out of a vibrant industrial tradition. Therefore, this development was also referred as proto-industrialization, for it was a stage of rural industrial development, with wage workers and hand tools that preceded the emergence of large-scale factories. This was a period of almost industrialization that eventually led to the Industrial Revolution. It involved hand tools as opposed to machines. Contemporaries called it the putting out system.
Now let's turn to Monica for a deeper look into the cottage industry.
I am here right now, currently, with a merchant capitalist to explain on this system.
So, the putting out system sounds like a weird name for an industry, but there's a good reason. The two participants in the putting out system were the merchant capitalist and the rural worker. The merchant capitalist would loan or put out new materials to several cottage workers, and the worker would return the finished product to the merchant.
We've heard that there are multiple ways rural workers can manufacture products. Is this true?
Yeah, definitely. There are endless variations to the system. Sometimes rural workers would buy their own materials, sometimes they work in groups. In all cases, though, this system was an early form of capitalism. The merchant capitalists needed large amounts of capital and sought to increase profits and capital in their businesses.
And can you explain the success of this system?
This system grew because it had competitive advantages. There was an abundance of underemployed labor, and there was a higher degree of flexibility where skills maintained quality but discouraged the development of new methods, and many different kinds of goods were produced.
The putting out system did not spread across Europe evenly. It was most successful in England, where it first appeared. It was particularly successful in spinning and weaving of woolen cloth.
The latter part of the 18th century witnessed a remarkable expansion of rural industry in certain densely populated regions of continental Europe.
One typical activity of cottage workers that were engaged in the putting out system was the making of woolen, linen, and cotton cloth. known as the textile industry. Here's Seth and Isabella with an inside look into the lives of rural textile workers.
The textile industry was not just an economic system, but a way of life, as seen through the cottage of the English rural textile worker. They lived in small, often one-room cottages. Out of the few pieces of furniture in the cottage, the loom was the largest and most important.
The cottage was also equipped with spinning wheels, tubs for dyeing cloth and washing raw wool, and carding pieces to comb and prepare for the raw material. All of this equipment were required due to the fact that the cottage industry was a family enterprise in that all members of the family helped out. Each family member had a task, including the very youngest and the very oldest.
The women and children prepared the raw material and spun the thread, and the man of the house wove the cloth. The fact that the entire family was involved in this industry encouraged cottage workers to marry early and have large families. Each weaver depended heavily on the work of 4 or 5 spinners to keep themselves steadily employed. Finding more thread and spinners was a constant struggle. This demand for thread may even lead couples to become capitalist employers.
However, the relationship between workers and employers was often marked by sharp conflict. Such conflicts included fights over the weight and or quality of the material and cloth. Workers were often accused of stealing by merchants, who in turn were complained to have delivered underweight bales.
From the merchant capitalist's perspective, another problem was that rural labor was cheap, scattered, and unorganized, which led to it being hard to control. Cottage workers were often observed working in spurts, meaning that after they got paid on Sunday, they would spend a few days relaxing and drinking.
When times were good and the merchant could sell all of his products, the weaver and his family did well and were more inclined to slack off. The putting out system in the textile industry definitely had its issues from the employer's perspective. Merchant capitalists were even more inclined to search for more effective methods of production.
Overall, the agricultural revolution made a big impact across Europe.
The increase in the production of agriculture due to the better techniques and tools provided people with more food and caused population to rise. In addition, more food caused prices to drop, which meant that more people could spend more money on consumer goods.
Larger farms began to dominate agriculture through their machines and scientific farming.
As the amounts of small farmers declined, they moved closer to cities and caused populations of cities to increase.
And that's our show.
Catch us tomorrow when we talk about the Atlantic trade.
I'm Steph.
And I'm Lauren. Good night.